I had to apologize to my husband the other day because he used to warn me about Bermuda grass back in the day when I didn't know much about plants. He would spend time in the spring helping me to weed the flower beds around the house and to mulch them. And he would talk about why this was such an awful plant. And I used to just shake my head at him and say something like, well, it's nice for homeowners with grass to have something that's so easily maintained. Boy, do I wish those words never came out of my mouth. Hi, everybody. Welcome or welcome back to my garden. My name is Vanessa, and I turn our yard into our own little happy place at home, and I want to give you whatever tools I have to help you do the same. Today, I'm going to be warning you about a plant more than anything. Sometimes the best way to minimize maintenance in our garden is to avoid some plants to begin with. And this is not a plant that I chose, but it was here. And if it's not in your yard already, I hope that you avoid it like the plague that it is. Sometimes I see progress being made in horticulture and it warms my heart. But I recently heard that some university students somewhere were working on making Bermuda grass more heat and drought resistant. And I about screamed. Bermuda grass needs no improvement. In fact, the exact opposite is true. If some work could be done towards its eradication, that would be wonderful. If you've never seen Bermuda grass, I think God has blessed you. It is a turf that can spread well. To say quickly is an understatement. It can spread by seed or by rhizomes, which means that it can send shoots underground in every direction, and it does. And it can also spread by what are called stolons, which means that above ground, everywhere that it touches the ground, it becomes a whole new plant, which then sends down rhizomes or sets seed. Anything that can spread that many ways is just hard to control. I have been fighting this grass in my flower beds as long as I've had a garden, and I won't be winning this fight anytime soon. I could name many reasons why I dislike this plant and why you should avoid planting it, but I'll stop at three. The first reason I very much dislike this plant is because it's impossible to dig out of the flower bed in our clay soil. I can speak for my clay soil, but I imagine that this thing is a nightmare no matter the soil. We've tried our best to keep it out of the garden beds. But even in the garden beds where we did our due diligence to first dig up the Bermuda grass, it's still there. And in the flower beds where we use cardboard to eradicate all other weeds first, it's there. This is because it's one of those plants that regrow if any piece of it is left behind in the soil or left behind touching the soil. It will also travel underground for long distances until it can reach sunlight. And so, even in the places where we lay down tarp or some sort of barrier for weeks at a time, it's often still alive because it goes to the very edges of the tarp to go and find sunlight. You would think that, well, the solution would be to dig it out really good. But I assure you, I've spent countless hours doing just that, and it always comes back. The second reason I dislike this plant is the fact that it's not just hard to dig out, but being hard to dig out means that it inevitably just takes over by the end of the season. I try to weed as much as I can every spring and even early summer, but this plant is a beast. Bermuda grass is one of those grasses that take off in the heat, and so while in the spring it's inconsequential in the flower beds, thereby giving me a false sense of temporary victory, I'm almost always humbled by August when, for the most part, it's the primary weed that just springs up and refuses to budge from the flower beds. I weed it one day, and 3 days later, it's back. I have one long border on the back of my property here that I started a few years ago. You can see it in this video, just how horrible the Bermuda grass has taken over by early fall. I just took this video a couple of days ago. Keep in mind that this section was mulched with 6 inches of mulch just 4 months ago in June. Before I mulched it in June, I spent maybe 4 to 5 hours on my hands and knees pulling out as many of its roots as I possibly could. I even tilled the section first so that I could get the roots out. I got wheelbarrow upon wheelbarrows of it, and this is the result 4 months later. The other reason I have a hard time having success pulling out wiregrass is because our soil is clay, and red clay in July is so hard because we normally have a drought. It's a lot easier and perhaps even satisfying to pull it out a few days after it's been raining, but still, inevitably some pieces get left behind, and by the end of summer, well, you saw the result. The third reason I dislike this plant is that it makes it hard for us to improve our lawn. Listen, I am not a grass expert. I love my gardens, but I don't spend an exuberant amount of time making sure that my lawn is just one kind of grass. In fact, my lawn is full of clover, and I love it that way. I love seeing the clover in bloom. But the other thing that my lawn was full of long before we moved on this property was Bermuda. We don't get the feeling that it was intentionally planted either, which is good. We bought the house from an old elderly lady who could not keep up with the maintenance anymore. So I'm thinking that it came in at some point and she just didn't have opportunity to care for it. And like all weeds of this caliber, it quickly took over. It's so obvious in early spring that this awful weed is part of the grass because it doesn't really take off until the heat, as I mentioned. So for a few good weeks at a time in spring, after all the other grasses have long come in, we just kind of stare at bare earth in some spots. We've thought about digging the whole lawn area up, but that's so daunting. There's just not an easy way to kill all that grass and start over. But we're going to have to figure something out because as long as this grass is on our property, then we don't stand a fighting chance with it in our flower beds. One glimmer of hope we got this last year is we had to reseed one section of the yard because it had been dug up for septic work. That section looks so nice this year, especially in comparison to the rest of the turf that we have. This has caused us to be toying with the idea of digging up the whole thing and starting over with the lawn. I had to apologize to my husband the other day because he used to warn me about Bermuda grass back in the day when I didn't know much about plants. He would spend time in the spring helping me to weed the flower beds around the house and to mulch them. And he would talk about why this was such an awful plant. And I used to just shake my head at him and say something like, well, it's nice for homeowners with grass to have something that's so easily maintained. Boy, do I wish those words never came out of my mouth because, ironically, by far, the piece of maintenance that take the most of my time in my garden is weeding out these beastly things. I really don't think I can ever eradicate it from my yard. It's in my neighbor's yard as well. With the flower bed that is so bad, I'll probably have to put down plastic for a few years to try to give myself a fighting chance. But for now, because misery loves company, why don't you tell me about your most terrible weed that you fight in your garden? Or any tips for me about Bermuda grass? I'd love you forever if you help me to eradicate this thing without all the chemicals. I don't think there is a way. Until then, Godspeed, my noxious plant fighting friends. I don't always talk so negatively about plants. Most times I offer solutions. And so I invite you here to watch this video, which is a little masterclass on hydrangeas. I get asked the most questions about hydrangeas. And so I made this hydrangea video to pass on to people like you to help you understand this plant. It will help you. See you there.